In an alternate reality, the Nazis are busy trying to annex Britain while Stalin's about to launch a surprise attack on Germany. The US is sitting back and watching from a distance, but there's one great big issue that will soon get the Americans involved. Can you guess what it is? You'll find out later. We're not going to say the Nazis and the Communists agreed with each other and fought alongside. We wouldn't be so ridiculous as to say Hitler stopped despising communism and that Stalin put down his axe and stopped swinging out against fascism. We're talking about a devil's alliance today, a dirty, horrible partnership based solely on the cynical logic of realpolitik. Hitler and Stalin make a deal. Nonetheless, Hitler would still think Stalin was a cunning Caucasian, and Stalin at some point would still want to free people from the yoke of fascism. But they would join together to achieve some immediate aims. Before we talk about what the alliance would look like and what would happen, we at least should make it look plausible. So, here's some background information. The world was not a safe place in the 1930s. Under Adolf Hitler, the German military was once again a powerhouse. In 1933, Hitler had taken Germany out of the League of Nations. He'd also snubbed the World Disarmament Conference. He'd secretly rearmed the German forces, which, if it weren't for an anti-Nazi German journalist named Karl von Ossietzky, it would have stayed a secret longer. After the Wall Street crash of 1929, the German populace was looking for a way out of extreme poverty. The Nazis as well as the Communists were on the rise in Germany. Communism and fascism in many parts of the world were looking to many people like a safer bet than what had turned out to be corrupt and reckless capitalism. In the 1930 German federal election between them, the Nazis and the Communists won close to 40% of Reichstag seats. In 1934, nearly a third of people in working-class areas in Germany wanted Hitler as their leader. Many shouted in the street, "Hitler for Germany, all of Germany for Hitler." Sure, many Germans were afraid to question Nazi propaganda, but by 1938, Hitler's charisma, with the help of Goebbels' propaganda, had led to a majority of Germans believing Hitler was some kind of Superman. They approved of his compulsory military service, of his new and massive Wehrmacht, and the remilitarization of the Rhineland. Germany had been weak, Hitler said, and now it was strong. He told his many followers, "I overcame chaos in Germany, restored order, enormously raised production in all fields of our national economy. I've not only politically united the German nation but also rearmed it militarily. I have led millions of deeply unhappy Germans who have been snatched away from us back into the fatherland. I have restored the 1,000-year-old historical unity of German living space." His concept of living space, or Lebensraum, was what Hitler believed was Germany's manifest destiny to have territory for 300 million Germans, and it meant that the Slavs and the Jews that lived in the territory he wanted would have no rights at all. Hitler had much of Germany in the palms of his hands when on August 23, 1939, he did something unexpected by Germans and governments abroad, especially considering his living space plan. He made peace with the Soviets, and this was very shocking and also confusing. Some Western communists said it wasn't true. The American communist screenwriter Herbert Biberman said it was nothing but fascist propaganda. It wasn't. Hitler signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviets, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The world found out at the Nuremberg trials in 1946 that there were secret protocols in the pact in which the two nations agreed to split up parts of Europe, including their agreement to partition Poland. Germany invaded Poland shortly after, while the Red Army did just the same. In some ways, they were a team. Stalin even sent German communists who'd gone over to Russia back to Germany. Some Germans arrested during Stalin's bloody purges went straight from the Gulag and into concentration camps. Both sides caused untold suffering in Poland. The Soviets famously murdered about 22,000 Polish army officers in the Katyn forest. Stalin deported close to 1 million Poles to Siberia and to various parts of Central Asia. The Nazis, meanwhile, walked into Poland and took land and property. They deported around 1 million Poles to work as slaves in Germany. They massacred people and rounded up Polish Jews, around 3 million of them, many of whom ended up dying in death camps. This pact of horror surprised the British and the French governments, both not keen on fascists or communists. Churchill was often fervent in his dislike for the Soviets. He said, "Never forget that Bolsheviks are crocodiles. I cannot feel the slightest trust or confidence in them." And later he said, "It would be a measureless disaster if Russian barbarism overlaid the culture and independence of the ancient states of Europe." As you'll see later, he often changed his tune. When Germany was busy invading Western Europe and doing so in a frighteningly speedy fashion, Soviet materials helped the Nazis considerably. In the German-Soviet Commercial Agreement of 1940, the Soviets sent the Germans huge amounts of raw materials, including grain and rubber. This wasn't a great idea in the long run, of course. Little did Stalin know what Hitler had in mind, which was the Nazi Generalplan Ost policy, the master plan for the East, replete with genocide and ethnic cleansing. For the millions of tons of cereal, wheat, oil, and cotton, the Soviets received those famous German weapons, including the country's latest warplanes, the Ju-88 bomber, the Bf-109, and 110 fighters. The Soviets also received tanks, ships, masses of machinery, and machine tools. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. Together, they were stronger. Stalin didn't believe it when the British in 1941 sent him reports stating the Germans were planning an invasion. When Germany unsuccessfully tried to beat the British in the Battle of Britain, Stalin was quite happy to watch those two countries weaken themselves. And when on April 3, 1941, Winston Churchill sent a message via the British ambassador to Moscow, Sir Stafford Cripps, saying the Germans were planning an attack on the Soviets, Stalin chose not to believe it. On May 31, 1941, Churchill said, "We have firm indications that the Germans are now concentrating large army and air forces against Russia." On June 12, the British Joint Intelligence Committee warned, "Fresh evidence is now at hand that Hitler has made up his mind to have done with the Soviet obstruction and to attack." Stalin still didn't want to trust the snaky British, and for good reason. The British were snaky. Even the Americans were wary of the British. Franklin D. Roosevelt often openly aimed hostility at the British Empire, criticizing Churchill's imperialism. As the New York Times wrote many years later, the two men were united but divided. Roosevelt's son, Elliot, was even more critical of the British, once saying that Britain and France had exploited their power and run the global banking system for too many years. After Germany invaded Poland, only 16% of Americans in a Gallup poll said American troops should be sent to Europe to help Poland, France, and Britain. This is important to know for the show today. As political realists might say, in a world where there's a balance of power politics, each nation is out for itself. Trust and loyalty are rare commodities in terms of realpolitik. Countries then would usually let nations fight it out rather than step in and help, especially if the fight weakens them both. They might only join the fight when one nation becomes too powerful. The passing of the buck happened in Europe for many years. Britain chose to fight the Nazis in the end, but for a while, that was not certain. Britain wanted to remain powerful and keep its empire, which would have happened for a while had it signed a non-aggression pact with the Nazis. But Britain was rightly concerned about German hegemony, so it fought. It was less ideological than it was a matter of staying powerful. On June 21, 1941, there was a sense of panic in the Kremlin. In the Soviet embassy in Germany, officials tried to contact the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Joachim von Ribbentrop, but kept being told he was out. They wanted clarification about something, which was news that the Germans were mounting a huge military operation on the Soviet border. They received a message saying Ribbentrop is not here and nobody knows when he'll return. In Moscow, the Foreign Affairs Minister Vyacheslav Molotov demanded the German ambassador, Friedrich Werner Graf von der Schulenburg, go directly to the Kremlin. Schulenburg received the message while he was destroying German documents. He went to the Kremlin and neither confirmed nor denied the news. Schulenburg had been against the invasion. Like many, he believed invading Russia always ended in tears for the invaders. Look what happened to Napoleon. Schulenburg had actually previously warned Soviet officials, but had been ignored. It took time for Stalin to realize that the warnings he'd gotten so far were real, upon which Goebbels in Germany and Stalin was like a rabbit mesmerized by a snake. Stalin soon held a meeting with Molotov and Deputy Premier Lavrenti Beria. In what the military historian Antony Beevor said was an act of cowardice and humiliating for Stalin, they talked about giving up Ukraine, Belarus, and some of the Baltic states. On June 22nd, Molotov's voice was heard on the radio saying, "Today at 4 o'clock in the morning, German troops attacked our country without making any claims on the Soviet Union and without any declaration of war." He paused and then said, "Our cause is just. The enemy will be beaten. We will be victorious." You know what happened next, the bloodiest battle the world had ever seen. 40 million would die. Stalin would have around 300,000 of his own troops killed for cowardice and similar transgressions, not much less than the total British 450,000 and American 418,000 war deaths. This was a world war, of course, and many countries lost young men and civilians, but the battles on the Eastern Front could not be compared with any of the other battles that happened during the war. Not just the battles either, but the starvation and the massacres of civilians. So why did Hitler do this? Seems to us these days that it was an insane tactical blunder, but Hitler thought he could win, as did most other countries. The Soviets, despite how the West felt about them, were promised support. It wasn't out of ideological kindness. Britain believed a Soviet loss would mean trouble for its empire, and of course, Hitler coming back to Britain. Churchill said on the radio, "No one has been more a consistent opponent of communism for the last 25 years. I will unsay no word I have spoken about it." But all this fades away before the spectacle which is now unfolding. The past with its crimes, its follies, its tragedies flashes away. The Russian danger is therefore our danger and the danger of the United States. Churchill spent a lifetime trying to pull the US into fights, but he had a point. According to realistic logic, it wouldn't be a bad thing for Britain, for both Germany and the Soviets to weaken each other. Churchill did send military aid, as did the Americans, but rather than fight the Germans in Europe after the Soviet invasion, they stalled. The Americans didn't get involved militarily until 1941 when Pearl Harbor sealed the deal, but the Allied invasion of Europe didn't happen until June 1944. Before becoming president, U.S. Senator Harry Truman spoke the language of realists when he said, "If we see that Germany is winning, we ought to help Russia, and if Russia is winning, we ought to help out Germany. That way, we let them kill as many as possible, although I don't want to see Hitler victorious under any circumstances." He was talking the talk of a bait-and-bleed military strategy. When the Germans were successful at the Battle of Kiev and took 665,000 people prisoner after killing many more, they occupied Kiev. Hitler called it the greatest battle in world history. Back in the West, no one really believed the Soviets would hold out. They gave them no chance. Moscow would fall, they said. The Germans looked invincible. They knew it would be tough, though. At a meeting on May 2nd, the country's Armament Planning Secretariat said the war could only be won if the German army could feed itself from the captured Soviet lands. He wrote, "If we take what we need out of the country, there can be no doubt that millions will die of starvation." They expected the deaths of millions, but they thought they had to do it. The belief of the Germans were summed up by the commander of the 4th Panzer Group, Colonel General Erich Hoppner, when he said, "The war with Russia is a vital part of the German people's fight for existence." And it looked like the German invasion of the Soviet Union would be over quickly. The Germans sent around 3.8 million troops as well as thousands of tanks, aircraft, and other military vehicles. What the Germans didn't expect was how ruthless Stalin would be in his Order Number 227. Saying not one step backward. He meant it. The Russian military-industrial complex was also incredible as time went on. As people starved en masse, Stalin ensured the weapons were produced at almost miraculous speeds. It was a catastrophe for the Soviet people, but good for the West. As the historian Max Hastings said in his book Inferno, Stalin's war aims were as selfish and inimical to human liberty as those of Hitler. Soviet conduct only seemed less barbaric because it embraced no single enormity to match the Holocaust. Nonetheless, the Western Allies were obliged to declare their gratitude because Russia's suffering and sacrifice saved the lives of hundreds of thousands of British and American soldiers. Germany, in the end, met its nemesis on the Eastern Front. In 1943, Time magazine made Joseph Stalin Man of the Year. Years before, the same magazine had called him an enemy. Now it said this once brutal tyrant was behind the magnificent will of the Russian people to resist. Make no mistake, he was still a brutal tyrant, and he would be featured in Time magazine again, but it served the US at the moment to paint a nicer picture of Stalin. By the way, Hitler also won Man of the Year in 1938, but he was depicted as the devil incarnate. Stalin was a hero in '43, according to the American press, just as American generals were thinking about destroying his country in the near future. Time magazine couldn't have been more wrong when it said about Stalin, "There are reports in high circles that he wants no new territories except at points needed to make Russia impregnable against invasion." What Stalin wanted was what Hitler wanted: world dominance, or at least regional hegemony. At a Kremlin dinner in 1944, the commie-hating Churchill made a toast and said, "I've always believed, and I still believe, that it is the Red Army that has torn the guts out of the filthy Nazis." He later told the House of Commons, "I feel that their word is their bond. I know of no government which stands to its obligations, even in its own despite, more solidly than the Russian government." Stalin would soon become the enemy again with the Cold War on the horizon. The balance of power had gone too much in the direction of the Soviets and Soviet-style communism, and the US did everything it could to reverse that. Had Germany not invaded the Soviet Union, something similar would have likely happened. The balance of power, for a while at least, would have looked different, though. Hitler may have gone through with Operation Sea Lion, the plan to invade the British mainland. Accomplishing this would have taken colossal amounts of resources and manpower, which is the reason why countries attempting to become become hegemons don't usually attempt to invade militarily strong countries protected by water. Nonetheless, had Hitler waited and been patient, built a lot of new landing craft, expanded his navy, and watched the German economy grow as prisoners from already occupied nations slaved away in Germany's factories, the Nazis would have likely been able to invade Britain. It would have taken the entire might of the Nazi war machine, but it was accomplishable. In 1940, the British Army had 1.65 million men, and a year later 2.2 million. 3 million served in total. An astounding 13.6 million Germans fought in World War II. The British produced 27,528 tanks during World War II. The Germans produced 49,777. Hitler's navy was no match for the British Navy, which, including the Germans not having enough suitable landing craft, would have made the invasion incredibly hard. Still, the British Army was nothing compared to the German Army. In realist logic, it's not only how big your army is, it's how well it can perform, but the Brits were up against a larger and better trained German army. Things could have been different had Hitler grounded Britain's Royal Air Force by bombing the hell out of the airfields, not smashing their cities. Again, had he just held in there and kept going after Britain, we think he could have forced the Brits to sign a peace treaty. If that didn't happen and Hitler succeeded in a full-on land invasion, he would have brought back the British Fascist Party and its leader Oswald Mosley, as well as many of the 40,000 British fascists who would take up positions in the new Nazi-led government. Just like in France, there would have been British resistance, although we know from Hitler's Little Black Book that one of the first things he would have done in Britain is arrest 2,820 people he thought would cause him trouble. British folks watching this video might be thinking, no way, not on my great-granddad's watch. But just look at what Hitler managed to do in France. Sure, anti-Semitism was much more pervasive in France than Britain, and the French Popular Party, fascists, had around 120,000 members. It would have been much harder to placate Britain, but not impossible. The question is, would the Americans have sent troops to fight Hitler and help Britain? We should recall what Truman said about supporting whoever was winning. Remember, in the US, there was also a lot of criticism of the European imperialists. Also, the German-American Bund, a fascist party in the US, had about 25,000 members, and a large swath of America was against going to war against Hitler. There was also people such as Charles Lindbergh, an important voice in the US who was avidly non-interventionist and sympathetic in some respects to the Nazis, who'd actually awarded him the Service Cross of the German Eagle. He often spoke at America First committee events, whose speakers regularly spread pro-fascist and anti-Semitic rhetoric. Its 800,000 members believed that even if the British lost against the Nazis were no threat to the US. Many of them believed that the new Nazi European superpower would actually make a great trading partner. Make money, not war. The communists were the real threat. You also had people such as the industrialist Henry Ford, whose 1922 book, The International Jew, inspired many Germans who would become Nazis. Hitler called Ford a single great man, partly for calling Jewish people the world's foremost problem. What we're saying is we cannot be certain that the US would have come to Britain's aid. In a world of balance of power politics, that move might not have favored the US. What the US could have done is sell arms to Britain as the Nazis spent months, possibly even years, trying to invade. It would have been good business, and the Americans would have known Hitler would be too weak to pose any danger to the US after such a costly invasion. At this point, the Soviets and the Germans are still sticking to their 10-year peace pact. Stalin, rightly still fearing the Nazis, would have waited for Germany to become weaker in its fight with Britain, and then, we believe, he would have pounced. In real life, many historians believe Stalin was waiting for the right opportunity, and some say he would have attacked Germany as early as 1941 had Germany not attacked the Soviets first. Hitler always thought that could happen, which is why he had a preemptive war plan for the Soviet attack. The war between the two was always going to happen at some point. For once, this was about power as well as ideology. It's the Soviets, then, that will launch the attack, not the Germans. In this case, we must think about the balance of power again. If Germany managed to annex Britain, the US would certainly be concerned about Germany becoming the regional hegemon. But then the Soviets would have attacked Germany, so we're sure the US would have supported the Soviets just as they did when the invasion was the other way around. The worrying thing for the Americans, though, is that by 1941, scientists were already talking about the atomic bomb. In fact, the British tube alloys project was ahead of the American atomic bomb research effort at the start, at least in 1940, when the German-Jewish physicists Otto Frisch and Rudolf Perls figured out the critical mass needed to make the bomb. The device needed to reach critical mass and thus create a nuclear explosion that could also be made a lot smaller than hypothesized, which meant dropping the nuclear bomb from a plane became a great option. The US soon took over regarding the creation of the first atomic bomb, but in 1941 and 1942, there was no way on earth the Americans would just stand by while the Nazis took advantage of British scientists. Remember, in real life, the Americans believed the Nazis had made a lot of progress toward making a bomb, although this could not have been further from the truth. In our alternate reality, it would be in the interest of the US for the Soviets to invade the Nazis and so make it difficult for them to proceed with the atomic bomb research. With those British and British expat scientists, Nazis might well have raced forward in the progress they made toward the bomb. The US would have been in a difficult position. The Nazis having the bomb would not be good, and yet the Soviets having the bomb would not be great either, if they managed to defeat the Nazis and get their hands on the nuclear science. In 1940 and 1941, the Soviets were a lot further behind on nuclear research than the rest of the world powers, but this could have easily changed in our scenario with access to German scientists and research. So the US would have had to join the war and fight against whoever was winning in Europe and whoever was proceeding with the bomb project. US spies would have been helpful in that regard. The US then could have gone to war against the communists or the fascists. The Americans at this point would have no idea about concentration camps. Even if they did find out about the Nazis' final solution plan, stopping a country from possibly blowing up the world would have been the most important thing. So had the Nazis not invaded the Soviets, they would have focused on Britain longer and won. But the battle between the Nazis and the Soviets was always going to happen. If the Soviets churned out massive amounts of military machinery during the Nazi attack on Britain, they might well have succeeded in beating Hitler and so became the enemy of the US. In real life, the Soviets ended the war in a strong position, which worried the hell out of the Americans. Many Americans, including future President Dwight Eisenhower and Secretary of the Navy James V. Forrestal, wrote that Japan was ready to surrender and there was no need to drop the bombs. Right or wrong, they said it. Leo Szilard, one of the main people behind the US's bomb, later said after he spoke with the Secretary of State James F. Burns, Truman's chief advisor, he got the feeling the Japanese bombings were always about scaring the Soviets, not just beating the Japanese. In fact, declassified documents show that on August 30, 1945, when the Soviets and the US were supposedly allies, Major General Lawrence Norstad sent a document to General Leslie Groves that outlined 15 key Soviet cities to be hit with US atomic weapons, including Moscow. He wrote about another 25 leading Soviet cities to be hit, including Leningrad. The Americans always had the Soviets in their sights. Groves and Norstad estimated that 66 Soviet cities could be destroyed with 204 atomic bombs, which would obliterate the Soviet Union's aluminum production, as well as 95% of its aircraft, 97% of its tanks, and 95% of its oil refining ability. According to realist logic, the stronger country, the most threatening one, is the one that gets attacked. Despite the US and the Soviets still being allies and celebrating the end of the war, a top-secret Pentagon document dated September 15, 1945 explained, "The destruction of the Russian capability to wage war has therefore been used as a basis upon which to predicate the United States' atomic bomb requirements." To sum this all up, a Cold War was inevitable, but the enemy would depend on who won between the Soviets and the Nazis and who was leading the atomic bomb project. We also should mention that countries which lost millions of citizens, such as China, 15 to 20 million, Poland, 5.9 to 6 million, the Dutch East Indies or Indonesia, 3 to 4 million, India, 2.2 to 3 million, and Yugoslavia, 1 to 1.7 million, would have also been involved in the scenario. The side they support would have remained similar, but they wouldn't have had the influence or power to change the outcome of the scenario in a major way. Now you need to watch What If Japan Was Never Hit by Nuclear Bombs, or have a look at The Only Man to Survive 2 Nuclear Bombs.